So, yeah. All right.
That was good. That was a great intro, Dave. I loved it.
Welcome to the Plus 3 podcast.
Hey.
Sorry. Do people want to get some giggles out or?
No, just do
Okay,
it
cool.
again.
Keep those giggles in.
Welcome to the Plus 3 podcast. This week we're joined by Emma Stamm. She is a professor of philosophy at Villanova University, and her research lies at the intersection of critical theory, science and technology studies, and the philosophy of technology. Thanks for joining us, Emma.
Thank you for having me.
For sure. So, I know Nishay has known you for a longer period of time. I first became aware of your work maybe a couple years, maybe a year ago or so, actually, when I was banging around trying to find an old talk of my own and typed in turn on, tune in, rise up, and then stumbled across an article that you had written for Commune Mag dealing with Mark Fisher and capitalist realism and acid communism. And I was so delighted not only to find somebody else riffing on some of those themes, but also like making some very explicit tie-ins between psychedelics and politics, and particularly radical politics. So I just wanted to say it's really great to have you and to sort of find other people who are interested in advancing those discourses.
Well, it's great to be here. I've been familiar with symposia for a long time, at least maybe late 2013, actually. I remember at the Horizons conference talking to people about it back then. Just as a side note, was the title of your essay also Tune In, Turn On, Rise Up?
Well, it was a talk that I'd given at Boom way back in the day, and had sort of been like a fledgling foray into. So up to that point, I'd just been presenting a whole lot of like phytochemistry, sort of drug nerd, plants used in ayahuasca, this, that, and the other. And so Boom in 2014 invited me to give a talk, and yeah, that was the title, but it was like finding, again, it was totally buried. It's not like, for me, I took it as another moment of like spontaneous, like, of course, like somebody else had a similar idea about the sort of same themes. And so it was for me, it was like a joyful sort of finding somebody else kicking around the same notions, one of those like psychedelic synchronicities.
Yeah, no, that's cool. I have like a running joke in my head about the title of psychedelic media articles and how so many of them pull from pop culture and rock songs. It's a lot of like tune in, turn on, or the long strange trip of psychedelic medicine.
Totally.
Guilty.
It's those two and like a few other like psychedelic cliches that keep getting recycled, like next to something about like this new boundary pushing, brand new innovation in medicine that people are only beginning to talk about in this article came out like last week or something.
Right.
Yeah.
And then let's reference some culture from 40 years ago or 50 years ago almost while we're at it.
Yeah.
Which actually, I have to say, funny enough, like with the sort of focus on Mark Fisher and some of the concepts in, say, capitalist realism, that notion of this like endlessly recycled past and the way that impinges on the way that we imagine the future. Like, it's sort of funny that out of the gate we're finding ourselves immediately sort of in that conceptual space.
Mm-hmm. Hauntology. Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah. It pops up in all sorts of unexpected places. Yeah.
Do you think you could do our listeners a favor and just talk about hauntology for just a moment? Or just
sure.
a definition?
Sure. So hauntology was originally developed as a concept by the philosopher Jacques Derrida, and he was using it as a play on words, because in the French, in his original language, it would be pronounced ontology. So there's sort of a conceptual slippage between hauntology and ontology, which is the philosophical study of being, the nature of all things. Their ontological essence is what it is to be them. So he developed hauntology to express the fact that being is never just about a positivity about what is there, but also about what isn't there, and how writing especially, but actions, just phenomena in the world are always haunted by things that aren't there, and especially things from the past, traces of the past. And this relates to his theories of writing and what writing is specifically as set apart from thinking. So that's the Derrida side of thing. And then the cultural critic Mark Fisher took Derrida's elaboration of hauntology, and he applied it to his reading of late 20th and early 21st century culture to explain and just talk about why it is that, at least in his view, we weren't really developing anything new, why it at least felt like culture had really come to a standstill, why we even got the phenomenon of retro culture, where that came from, remix as a dominant approach to art, and what it means to endlessly iterate and reiterate the past instead of creating something new. So that's hauntology in a nutshell, and it relates to a lot of his other ideas, including capitalist realism and acid communism.
Thanks. That was super helpful. I also am reminded of the endless reboots.
Yeah,
Yeah.
totally. Well, and I think Fisher points to like Blade Runner and that sort of like retro future where that sort of melding of like sort of, we can't imagine a future that sort of deviates from the past beyond like taking those past tropes and just mapping them over a more futuristic version or projection of them.
Right. I kind of struggle with the idea of hauntology among the various frameworks that Fisher either elaborated or initiated as a conceptual thinker. I'm not sure that this endless scrutiny of 21st century culture as being sort of vacant and empty is as fruitful as he might have thought it was. His analysis of pop culture, I think, actually tends to focus too much on the mainstream, if that makes sense.
Totally.
Yeah, I feel like I'm not speaking to this very well. But
Well, maybe it's worth jumping into, and feel free, anyone, to object or pull things in a different direction. But I think on that front, like talking a little bit about acid communism might make sense for that, because like in my engagement with some of Fisher's work and some of the way that those ideas have been discussed, like even the way, say, in acid communism in the intro that's available, right? So because acid, for folks who don't know, acid communism was like an unpublished work that never, as far as I know, wasn't completed. And so there's just like this introduction that I think people have described as reading as a bit of a manifesto, and then there's no like further development of that. And for me, reading through the intro and the discussion, particularly of popular music, psychedelic influences on different sort of musical landscapes, and the way it's sketched out what's presented as taking up space, or sort of what is reflected in the music. To me, it it focuses on certain dominant, like it creates its own sort of dominant narrative, and sort of the way, I mean, funny enough, coming off of the conversation around hauntology, like the things that it decides to highlight and exclude, I think are, if not unique to Fisher, right? Like any lens you put on things is going to ultimately delimit what is or inside or outside of the frame. But looking at the way Fisher sets some of that up and some of the broader assertions he makes, particularly around the way some of that music is structured and the effects it had on society, and the way that some of the ideas, like he makes sweeping statements that I'm not sure necessarily hold if you examine it against I think to the point you were just making, Emma, like looking at, say, like countercultural movements like the Diggers or other sort of collectives that were, I don't know, like he sort of gestures towards it, but I don't think he maps out some of the rich, vibrant countercurrents, even as he sort of makes this narrative about counterculture. Sorry, I'll shut up.
Wait, and could I jump in just real quick? Because I was just thinking about, like, Derrida talks about monstrosity and the way that things that like break with the established like status quo way of doing things are like turned into like a stereotype and a caricature so that they can be defanged and incorporated in a way that is conducive to the concerns of dominant culture. And there's a way in which I think Mark Fisher talks about, not that that's the only trace of the counterculture, but that the counterculture has been troped and memed and turned into this like quaint sort of like aesthetic in a way that speaks to those titles that we were talking about at the outset, that is selectively choosing which aspects of the counterculture are usable for dominant culture and financial, corporations, stuff like that, with psychedelic companies in particular, but at the expense of like a selective forgetting of like certain other aspects and potentials that were part of that counterculture in the first place.
Yeah, I mean, maybe this is actually where we can tie acid communism and hauntology together. So the premise of acid communism is that the official target, or well, the real target of neoliberalism was different from its official target. If the official target of neoliberalism was Soviet-era communism, the specter of communism rising towards the end of the 20th century, then the unofficial, but according to Fisher, actually more impactful long-term effect of neoliberalism was to render not only culturally irrelevant, but almost unthinkable the experiments in reordering society, in thinking about ourselves, in material relations that began to be quite prominent during the 1960s into the 1970s, that neoliberalism wasn't just about attacking communism from the scary outside, the China and the Russia and whatever, which of course we still have circulating through our brain today or our American brains today as the specter that always haunts us. But it was about completely defanging, as Niché said, the very rich and actually quite transformative, and to a certain kind of person, threatening potentiality of those movements in the 1960s. So if hauntology does have anything useful to say, I think it would look at the way that we approach the past in popular culture, and kind of mine it for its most palatable and modular and potentially viral components, meaning its most commodifiable components. And we rescue that. We rescue and regurgitate that. But we don't remember, at least collectively, some of the more interesting, potentially transformative, and more subtle, more almost like psychosocial elements of those eras. So, for example, we aestheticize decades. It's like this is what the 1920s looked like. You would wear this certain dress or listen to this kind of music. This is what the 40s looked like, the 60s, the 70s. 90s retro has been in style for a while, and now the big thing is Y2K retro, which is really strange for someone my age, like to see like teenagers thinking it's really cool to have like the 2002 look. But of course, what it meant to participate in society in the 1990s or the early 2000s wasn't just about wearing, tight tattoo choker necklaces or, having a certain style of website that is now, a template that you can pull up on a very modern computer system or something like that. It's much more, it's much deeper than that, to put it simply. And if we're haunted by the past, I think we might be haunted by those traces that haven't surfaced because there's no market for them under capitalism, but yet they still haunt us. And I guess I have felt haunted by the 1960s without realizing it for a long time. And it's not the only past, I think, that's haunted me, but it's one that I have begun to take really seriously, cutting through a lot of the cynicism and really vapid readings of what the 1960s were all about, many of which come from leftists that would simply dismiss the 60s as an irrelevant, self-indulgent experiment and, escaping from society's responsibilities or whatever.
Yeah. I think that's really important that it's coming from like across the political spectrum, this like superficial stereotyping of that as self-indulgent. And maybe just because neoliberalism came up, maybe if someone could like just share a few words about what that is, just because people get like confused with that versus liberalism versus the left, and just to help orient people.
Someone else want to jump in?
Well, a phrase that's been bouncing around my head, and it seems like a good place to put it in, from acid communism, is Mark Fisher used this striking phrase of the mandatory individualism of neoliberalism. Mm-hmm. And how this was like a response in how you put it. The real target of neoliberalism was these consciousness raising, the be-ins, where people would, women or men would talk about their feelings, and then connect it to larger structural realities. So this could look like union organizing. This could look like, if I'm specifically looking at like some of the feminism in the 60s, like I can't remember the book that recommended this, but where women would like hold a mirror up to their genitals as a group, and that these kinds of things were, they were experiential, they were shared, they weren't lonely activities, and that the neoliberalism was this reaction to at least some parts of that.
And another phrase that I think is helpful is like the entrepreneurial, like, or the entrepreneurship of the self as like the sort of mandate under neoliberalism, where it gets back to this individualistic kind of mandate where you're expected to, a way that this touches like a lot of people, like younger people growing up, is like the college application process, where you have to like sell yourself and package yourself and engage in certain activities that signal your worthiness, that so you have to like be a mini corporation unto yourself, and everything is kind of turned into this like pressure to succeed in a way that gets you to that college, gets you to the next job, and where there's this really emphasis on helping individuals like help themselves, so a de-emphasis on welfare and other kind of social safety nets, and a focus on like individual mindset and drive and will to succeed, and tying success to personal willpower and efficacy, themes like that.
Yeah, there are a lot of different definitions of neoliberalism. Some people would point to specific economic policies or political events and try to establish a timeline for it. But what has been said so far is pretty much in line with how I think about it. So the phrase entrepreneur of the self, if I remember correctly, is from Michel Foucault, the philosopher, or some people would just call him a cultural theorist or an archaeology of cultural history. Or he was many different things, and not an uncontroversial thinker to this day, but he developed an idea called biopolitics, which essentially looks at the transformation of governance. So Foucault's work, for the most part, was about looking at intellectual history largely from the 18th century forward to figure out how power operates in the 20th century at the time that he was writing and alive, like the 1940s, roughly through the 1970s. And he began to take an interest in the relation between governance, so whatever a government in a particular nation looked like at a specific time, whether it was a monarchy or, what we have in the United States now, quote unquote, democracy. And governance and health. So why did political rulers all of a sudden take an interest in the individual and collective health of the populace? This began to happen towards the end of the 18th century into the 19th century with the recording of things like birth and death rates, tracking the spread of disease, all of that. And then he looks at the rise of contemporary psychiatry and asylums into the 20th century. And he makes this argument that contemporary governance and especially capitalist political systems have a vested interest in people's wellness so that they can be better productive subjects. So the government wants you to stay fit and healthy, maintaining a certain body mass index and not falling into what they'd call like a mental, some sort of mental illness, because if you do, you're not going to be able to produce as much. Neoliberalism is an extension and reinforcement of that logic, I think, where it's not just about being healthy and well, in your individual body, but making every single aspect of yourself, including those that don't necessarily map onto health, into something that produces, into something that is fully governed by the logic of a capitalist political order. So one example of a perfectly neoliberal thing to do is to, I don't know, go vote and then post a picture of yourself online with an I voted sticker, because there's so much going on there that's correct. You're showing your like happy, positive face in an online space. You're supporting the order as it exists by voting and saying that you're proud of voting. And you're sort of asserting yourself. It's like, okay, here I am. Here's my cute face, and here's my sticker, and this is on my individual profile. And if you click through 2 links, you can see me like listening to my favorite band or posting my like fitness stats. And this is all the world of me. Of course, all of those activities are actually financially valuable in this day and age of digital capitalism. But that's my perfect neoliberal moment.
This conversation caused me, while we were talking, to Google, on the Google Trends, look up the phrase personal brand. And since 2004, it's been steadily trending upward. And what you're describing is this thing that I don't know. One of my first jobs was in public relations, and I remember not being really aware of personal brand outside of people who had like a business, and then it migrating into like, you don't have a business, but you're an employee. And of course, there's that Black Mirror episode that that we might get into later. But, that personal brand.
Yeah, it's also... Sorry, did you?
Go ahead.
I just wanted to point out that, like, it's also worth highlighting that, like, as that personal brand shifts and as things move digital, like, there's this question. So, Emma, you brought up biopolitics as a construct, and now there's discussion about moving into the realm of like psychopolitics and sort of questions about sort of where that pressure, where that conceptualization of the self as this entrepreneur, as this like where are the enforcement mechanisms coming around that, and looking at Foucault and biopolitics and questions of sort of how those life or health governing decisions are made and by what entities. And now like moving into the realm of psychopolitics, where there are all of these pressures to post whether it's consumerist choices in the market or in an electoral context, and these creations of norms where there become these like societal expectations and the notion that you'll put yourself out there, the notion that you as your sort of self-interested brand entrepreneur, what have you, will then like perform in a way that shows what you have and signals your values to all of the people around you in this digital landscape. And then everybody sort of reacts. You get these cascades of digital social interactions in which a bunch of people are sort of performing their understanding of what they should look like as an individual, and bringing that. I think one of the funny things about sort of some of the early neoliberal definitions we were talking about is we almost engaged in a bit of a like neoliberal individualization of the definition of neoliberalism, where it's like we were talking about what it looks like for the individuals and not discussing some of like the broader maybe like market policies or the notion of eliminating regulation or these vast systemic things that are enforced fundamentally down the barrel of a gun, right? When we look at like the state apparatus that sets it up, but then there's nobody who has responsibility for it. It becomes this faceless bureaucracy, whether, sort of in the form of the state or now looking at say some of that digital landscape. Sorry, I realize I just threw a bunch out there, but
no, there's
like you do.
There's so much to say. Well, I think, at least I'll speak for myself, but maybe other people were thinking this as well. Neoliberalism also absolutely is a series of policies and decisions that were made by people. I'm thinking of Reaganomics. I'm thinking of what happened in the UK under Margaret Thatcher, that had profound structural and societal effects. It's not something that only happened to individuals, but there is potentially a problem in saying that we just neoliberalism, because I think that one of the effects of neoliberalism is indeed to make it very impossible to think outside of this individual society binary. Like, we're either going to analyze things at the level of the individual or we're going to analyze things at the level of society. My premise has always been that we need to look at the microcosm as like a tiny fractal tendril of the macrocosm and vice versa. That's a super psychedelic person thing to say. What goes on in our heads, what counts as psychopolitics, which that's a term that has specific meanings as developed by specific thinkers, but we can get into that in a sec if we want to. that's not very different from what has gone on at the collective level. So as we, I'm trying to think of a good example here. While we are all sort of trying to actualize ourselves as individuals and build our individual brand, I think that we get this idea of society as something that is only made up of individuals, that there's no sort of emergent phenomenon. And by emergent, I mean like a whole that is greater than the sum of its parts. So people stop being so interested in working at the societal level, and they stop seeing the point of it. They do politics in a way that is highly individualized and that has serious material ramifications. So a lot of people vote. For a lot of people, voting is the only really tangible political thing that they do, or they may donate some money, or they, if they have the time, volunteer a little bit, but they don't take politicking as a serious daily activity. They may not get involved in local politics, and they may not understand how thinking about smaller daily activities and interactions, or politicizing smaller daily activities and interactions, has a very real effect. And then that, that just cascades into a degradation of the image of politics and a literal degradation of the material conditions of our lives. So hopefully this isn't too loose of a connection that I'm about to make, but I think you guys will know what I'm talking about, and maybe the audience will be able to follow along. People really don't like it when you politicize psychedelics. And I'm getting... I mean...
really?
Yeah, talk about preaching to the choir. I mean, I know
I think
that
it's only a certain type of politicizing psychedelics.
Well,
kind of, though.
Yeah, I'm going somewhere with this. It depends on what we mean by politicking, politicizing. I'm really getting my first taste of this in a meaningful way these days. I did a podcast interview a few weeks ago, went live a few days ago. Someone put it up on Reddit, and man, they were like pretty... I mean, I only read one or two comments, and then I just had to shut it off. But the two comments that I read were like, how dare you do this? Like, psychedelics completely transcend tribal politics. That was the term that some commenter used. Or like, wow, this is total garbage. Ouch, this is like overly theoretical and like bringing psychedelics into an impure space. And then I go back to what I would tell my students when I taught political theory, just that whatever you think politics is, it's more than that, probably, unless you're like super on the level in a way that I certainly was not as an undergrad. But to politicize anything, whether it's something joyful, or usually joyful, at least for me, like a psychedelic experience, or just talking to a neighbor, talking to a colleague, walking through your city, looking around, it doesn't mean bringing it down to this sort of dreary, impure, negative space. All that politicization means is to look at something and ask yourself how we can work together to make this into the image of what people actually want. So I suppose there's a negative aspect there where you're saying that things could be better. They're not perfect as they are, but working together to create better conditions for everybody in a way that can feel very, very positive and very, very joyful. You know, not just the sheer horror and hell of watching the news every night.
Totally. Yeah, I just want to throw out, you know, like collectively, like we've certainly experienced those vibes. Personally, like I think Nishay and I were at Entheogenesis Australis together in 2017, and I was asked to just like fill a spot for somebody who didn't show, and so I sort of whipped up a quick sort of politics and psychedelia and let's get into it again, because I'd already done one talk on that. And the first commenter at the end of that, you know, gets up and says something to the effect of, "How dare you bring your ugly politics into our beautiful psychedelic space?" And one of the things, I mean, Rick Doblin was there. I'm floored by the fact. So, I know a lot of the people who've given me this critique as well about like putting politics into their psychedelic space. A number of them are big Maps and Doblin fans. And I've got a quote from Rick Doblin right here where he says, "I like to say that I don't do science. We do political science because the choice of drug and the choice of patients is designed with politics in mind." So this notion that somehow we're bringing politics into this space, you know, even if people want to believe that there is such a thing as apolitical social interactions or human interactions, which I don't think really holds. But even if you want to accept that, like, you know, the notion that you've got some of the least critical, sort of most widely lowest common denominator supported organizations being very explicit about the fact that they're doing politics, and what else could drugs for veterans experiencing PTSD in the context of the American war machine be, if not politics? So
And that point aside as well, I just want to remind people that psychedelic drugs are completely illegal as well. So like any sort of even discussion surrounding them is inherently political as well.
Well, and there's, in addition to all of that, there's like a parallel, I think, to be, and we've talked about this a bit in the past, but to be made with like Gamergate and the ways that, like, you know, feminist analysis of games and like the ways that like games could be otherwise or more inclusive, or, you know, the sort of choices that are being made and the stories that are being told and what the implications of that are, was reacted to like really harshly by, you know, reactionary elements of the gaming society. And I think part of that has carried over in the sense that people are so on guard against the encroachment of what they see as like woke culture, that they're like ready to snap like once they see like a hint of it coming into what they consider their like fun space that they go to and that means a certain thing to them. They're like, no, we want to shut this down, we're not going to accept this here. And I think that there's just an element of that. And just the last thing I'm going to say is about part of the reason we at Symposia have come together as a group is precisely because it can be hard as an individual to have that kind of reaction constantly. You know, if you're on your own and hearing this, like, you're the problem, why are you bringing negativity into this space, even though you are honoring the content of your psychedelic experiences and what you see as meaningful and what you feel driven to contribute to the conversation. As a group, as a collective, it has been a lot easier to weather those kinds of reactions, and just having people like a sanity check saying, no, you have a right to be voicing these opinions, and to show that you can, there is a space for the left in psychedelia, which, like, you know, we felt really strongly about.
It's a little one.
Part of our
It's a little itty bitty one.
I just feel like, you know, if I was just an individual with interest in psychedelics and coming into the space, like, it could be really off-putting and like, whoa, like, I don't want to have anything to do with this, you know, and just like people that I would want to be here might be discouraged and go away. So part of what we're trying to do is to kind of create a bitty little space where people can see, like, oh, like, this sort of, like, I can be, the sort of conversations I want to have can have a space here. And so thank you for helping to kind of cultivate that as well.
Totally.
Yeah, I have a lot to say to all of those great points that you all just made. First is that I interviewed Jeremy Gilbert for the article that I wrote for Commune Mag. Gosh, that interview took place in like December 2018. So Jeremy Gilbert is, or was, I should say, a colleague of Mark Fisher's, and Fisher actually drew quite heavily from Gilbert's work in developing acid communism. The phrase acid communism is Mark Fisher's brainchild, but Gilbert was already working on revitalizing the scholarly and para-academic discourse around the 1960s in psychedelia and leftism. He was doing that before Fisher took an interest in it, and Fisher's work on acid communism, which really, at least in terms of what's published, is not very extensive. It's like one piece of writing, maybe a few talks aside from that. But yeah, Fisher's work comes out of Gilbert's work to some degree. And Gilbert said to me that we have this historical myopia, we meaning people interested in psychedelics and hippie culture, where we really have forgotten just how politicized these substances were in the 1960s. And whereas we may associate them with libertarians now, or we may fully depoliticize psychedelics, or just scoff at the political tendencies associated with 60s psychedelia, this was a very serious and very real movement. And as I've said in other spaces, the hippie movement overlapped with and had very important relations with some of the other social movements that are still very deeply felt and very important to this day, like the LGBT liberation movement, the Black liberation movement, the women's rights movement. I mean, there were conflicts between what we call the hippies, at least the stereotypical image of the hippies now, and those movements as well. But a lot of important things came out of the 60s that we can't just dismiss. I mean, Black Lives Matter, by the words of many of its own advocates, is a direct descendant of the 1960s Black Power movement. So there's that. I also wanted to bring up something that I've been thinking about a lot recently that's been bothering me, which is that corporadelic things, the corporadelic world as you have defined it, is having a really negative impact on the way that leftists think about psychedelics, and more broadly about just what I would call 60s hippie things, which are, you know, so poorly treated. They see psychedelia and actual psychedelic chemicals being advocated for by the likes of Goop and by venture capital funded startups that they have always been very suspicious of. So now it's just another sort of nail in the coffin. Like, well, if it wasn't these escapists who just ruined their minds by taking the brown acid, it's these Silicon Valley types who have no sense of responsibility to society as a whole. So they're twice as bad, and we could never touch this. And by extension, leftist critiques of neoliberalism have put this circle around everything that feels new agey or feels wellnessy or feels individually self-actualizing, and now it's all bad, and that to me seems really misplaced.
I want to speak to some of that. And also sort of the topic of psychedelics and politics and the sort of reactionary, allergic reaction, as I've heard it put, to talking about politics and psychedelics, sort of the politicization of psychedelics. For a long time, there's been this sort of Brahmanic thread through psychedelia, where there was, lots of people taking psychedelics, but only, certain types, like, Leary from Harvard, or Rick Doblin, also coincidentally from Harvard, who like have license to, you know, speak and vision about psychedelics. But I mean, we have evidence that millennials are taking psychedelics at rates equal to or greater than the boom generation ever did. Psychedelic use is common. It's according to some statistics, LSD use in Americans it's at 11% and 20% for psychedelics generally. If we're talking lifetime use, and so there's this like sort of dichotomy between a bunch of people who, you know, have to go to work and have to actually face the mental health and legal stigma, and of course the baggage, the cultural baggage of the 60s for having indulged in and experimented with psychedelics. And then you know, couple that with the sort of the way that the left has been historically is and continues to be criminalized and attacked by capital, whether it be, you know, unions or what have you, that these left voices and perspectives on psychedelics and drugs generally are very small. However, like we have some examples, like there are drug users unions, much more in the sort of IV world, trying to do harm reduction in super radical ways. Like folks in BC are handing out tested pure methamphetamine and heroin, like right in front of the cop shops as civil disobedience, you know? But I think sort of tying things back into sort of neoliberalism in the sense that there's a mandatory individualism, but when it comes to some of these really powerful experiences that people have on psychedelics, I think a lot of people struggle to speak about them publicly because of the pervasiveness of irony as a way of not being earnest. I'm not serious about anything. Please don't hit me. You know, that kind of thing.
Yeah, that's a real problem. To this day, I have kind of a weird relation with the psychedelic community, you know, broadly construed, whatever that means. I've tried to kind of get into it, like onto psychedelic meetups in different cities that I've lived in. I've been to a bunch of different conferences. Incidentally, I grew up and my family's house until very recently was really close to where Alex and Allison Gray have their Chapel of Sacred Mirrors in upstate New York. So I've been there a bunch of times. And it was always like maybe 50% of the time I'd feel comfortable and welcome. And then sometimes I just felt like way too critical, or when I would really get into a conversation with somebody that I met, or through plenty of online interactions I've had in psychedelic online communities, that there was just no room for what I was trying to say and how I was making sense of these experiences. Like if I wanted to talk about how it made me as an individual feel better and, you know, I saw God, that's great. But I was always very committed to a leftist perspective. And as I've said in other contexts, to me, politics, my commitment to politics comes before my commitment to psychedelics. And I hate to think of it that way. But I mean, I don't think that it makes sense to even, you know, split them apart like that. But if I can only find people who are either completely apolitical as they self-identify, or they've got a strongly libertarian ethos, or they are not open to leftism whatsoever, then I don't know if I really belong here. And I've got my like small circle of friends that I can talk to, and we're kind of on the level. But yeah, it's been strange. And my research, even though I wrote my doctoral dissertation about psychedelics and referencing a ton of empirical scientific research on psychedelics, I've had a harder time communicating it to the psychedelic research community than I have to the fields that I am
You too?
identified with. Yeah, it's a strange world.
It's
yeah.
incredible.
Critical theorists, philosophers of technology, people in philosophy in general is definitely my world. About if I go to a psychedelic conference and, talk to somebody after their talk about what I'm doing, I'm not sure it's going to make sense.
So
I
everybody wants to reply. All right, somebody else go.
I think it can make I think it can make sense. I think there's a lot of people in the space, from academia to enthusiasts or whatever, who what we're all discussing, that does make a lot of sense. But there's not necessarily that space, or that there's not that space to really talk about it, I guess.
There's a few things there, right? Like you've got the people who are very much on side but are sort of hiding because it's not, even among like more visible people. Like there are researchers that we know who are quite on side, and yet you are unlikely to encounter them opining on that, certainly in any depth publicly. But if you get them on a private call, you could go on for hours about, punch Nazis, make psychedelics accessible type discourse, to crib from one of them. But like, in hearing some of the things you laid out, there's this weird, and this goes back to some of the earlier points as well, like there's almost been a weird alliance of like historical revisionism between certain leftists or radicals and liberals with regards to what psychedelic history presented, or what the content was, or sort of what lessons could have been learned, what sort of activism went on in those spaces. And looking at some of the things now, like for me, part of the reason I decided to be as vocal and unapologetic about some of this stuff in psychedelic spaces was precisely because it felt too important to just cede to the tech bros and the libertarians. And and this was at a point sort of thinking about like 2014, 2015, where I think shortly thereafter, or around that same time, Eric Davis wrote this thing about like the sort of future meaning making or whatever of psychedelia being kind of up for grabs. And I remember reading that and being like, yes, that's the project that I've been trying to grab like a small piece of this, to avoid this becoming like, psychedelics for microdosing, for efficiency, or looking at, in your piece in Commune Mag, I think Jeremy Gilbert claims that the libertarian strains are anomalous, or historically anomalous. And, I would be willing to agree and potentially like agree more like at the time that he said it. But if we look at what's happened even in the last, 3-4 years, and the way in which, like, I think at this point we can say this is no longer an anomaly. Like there is a real, and if we look at folks like, we just did a live stream on Dave Rubin interviewing Christian Angermeyer. If we look at the way Jordan Peterson is jumping in, whether with Roland Griffiths or Brian Murarescu or any of these other figures, I think there is a concerted effort for sort of encroachment into this space from reactionaries and people who I think have a sense of how they can use this terrain to their, and some of like the content and certainly dominant discourses that come with it to their advantages. And I think in that sense, it becomes even more important to contest that in this moment. This sort of unfortunate downside of that is it comes with that Reddit shit show, and it comes with the reactionary pushback. And so like it really is great to have you on, and to be able to, I hope going forward, like figure out ways to sort of solidify some of these engagements and figure out what other projects we can work on in order to try to normalize some of this space, even, within or on the edges of psychedelia. Because just as a final cap on that, because you also run into issues in leftist spaces where, when we were talking about illegality earlier, like I've known plenty of people in Earth First and other radical groups where they will acknowledge a personal psychedelic usage, or they will acknowledge some familiarity, but then either because of the bullshit ideology or apolitical orientation of dominant psychedelic discourse, or simply because of the sort of backdoor threat that the vulnerability that acknowledging that and discussing that more loudly presents to them in their activist lives, it's not nearly as visible.
Yeah. Sorry, go ahead, Nishay.
Well, I just wanted to say, it was just real quick, just back to the point of the difficulty of speaking to like the researchers of the conferences. I think there's also, we're talking about the personal brand and the ways that like people are encouraged to kind of like, there's just been a lot of thought leaders like in this space. We've talked about this in past podcasts, but like people where like your ability to package expertise and present it is more important than actually having expertise and experience.
Yeah.
And that some of the researchers are happy to align themselves with like the personal brands of people that they feel like are in their interests. And so you're or can either like Tim Ferriss, who has money, purse strings available, or otherwise there's a lining of interests that make it so that some of the researchers are more willing to entertain some of these like ideas that actually align well with you previously circulated Sadowski's Too Smart, and it was in the 10 Theses on Digital Capitalism. It was talking about the modern technocrat who focuses on problems and solutions that concern their desires and dislikes or improve their net worth or influence, all while making claims about saving the world and offering like solutionism. And that maps so well onto like Angermeyer, who we're just talking about, who's like giddy at the thought of medicalizing certain problems because it meant that he could profit off of it. So there's this like sort of perverse economy circulating between some of the researchers, not all, and these like corporate actors that make it so that because of their interests, they're more likely to embrace ideas that are going to lead to profit for them rather than ideas that are going to kind of jeopardize that whole enterprise.
Sure. I mean, that's the neoliberalization of academia. That's what that looks like. Certainly the need to brand yourself as an academic or as somebody who traffics in ideas for a living. It's had a really toxic effect on that as a cultural institution, I think. And I speak as someone who has a really hard time making herself intelligible to like a general scholarly audience or even just a general audience because of my background is interdisciplinary. So it's on my mind a bit at the time. But to pick up on some of the things that you said, Nishay, and before that, I think it was David speaking. One of the one suspicion that I have about why psychedelics and psychedelic culture has taken this turn to the right, at least the alt-right, the libertarian side of things, has to do with the way that the left makes sense of politics. And I don't want to throw leftists under the bus, but there is a very, I think, defeatist mindset that pervades leftism. There's been a sort of emotional and psychological deflation, and Fisher talked about this throughout his career. I think leftists may understand this at the intellectual level, that we have really internalized this idea that we cannot think beyond the structures of capitalism. Like, we can write that sentence out, we can say it out loud, but what it means to really acknowledge that and try to work against it, I'm not sure that leftism has gotten there yet. And because there is that psychic disposition, perhaps it's a spurious connection to make. It's not like you can prove this connection with a scientific test or anything like that. Just my opinion. But if there's any weight to that, if there is a psychic disposition of the left that's that cynical and that deflated, they wouldn't necessarily be open to psychedelics and the psychedelic experience as part of their political project. I mean, it just seems so beyond, so incommensurate with the project of, criticizing everything existing, to use a phrase from Marx. Or really tackling society's structures at the structural level. Like, how can you do that if you're in the afterglow of an LSD trip and everything feels really wonderful? Wouldn't it take you out of that mindset? So sorry, I have like one more sentence. I'm rambling a little bit.
No, you're great.
So taking what I think is an acid communist perspective on politics, it is to, as I mentioned earlier, rethink what it actually means to do politics, and also to think and to feel politics, and to be open to something that may be very, very different from what we've received and just what's been drilled into us from a very young age, since we were teenagers, practically, about what politics looks like.
Yeah. So the sense that I get, my parents lived through the 60s, and just from reviewing the literature and media from the era, like the sense that you got, even with people like with the Brotherhood of the Eternal Love, people who were firmly in psychedelia, was it felt to them that they did have the ability to win, that they did have the ability to bring about a cultural and or political revolution. And you're right. A lot of people have commented that the left is not willing to play to win. And some of my favorite critics out there have said we need to do something about this. But it's sort of strange, because the mainstreaming of psychedelics is sort of a weird perversion of that playing to win. It's they really betrayed the larger project of changing society, and instead we're being sold an ersatz version of it that individualizes the revolution and says, to hell with your neighbors, deal with your own trauma, and we're not going to talk about the systemic predictors of that trauma, and you're not going to be taking psychedelics in some sort of irresponsible way with a bunch of people without a minder. In fact, the way that psychedelic therapy is being postulated now, imagined, codified, is you're literally outnumbered in a room with somebody who's trying to put you back together again as a useful member of society.
Yeah.
Well, just as to advance that even slightly, like it goes even like it's worse than that even, right? In the sense where, like, if we look at, as Neşe just touched on with like Christian Angermeyer, like we see, and it was already sort of happening, I think, not really behind the scenes, but like as an unexamined byproduct of the way that MAPS and some of the nonprofit people were conceiving of things. But now with the corporadelic crush, like we're seeing excitement for the notion of pathologizing what I would consider to be normal, healthy responses to the fallout of industrial capitalism and civilization more broadly, like our social structures. And to then to pathologize that, to say like this is not an appropriate response to the things going on in the world around you. In fact, we're going to subject you to this medical regimen designed to return you to functionality as a good producer, consumer, what have you. The fact that this has become the dominant discourse in this space, and in such a way where Angermeyer can make totally fact-free assertions about human aging and sort of work relations and all of these things, and just, throw it out there, and continues to get appearances and traction and normalize this discourse in the space. And of course, with people like Peter Thiel and the other billionaires who are involved, like this is going to get, I think, a hell of a lot worse before it gets better, which is maybe me sort of reiterating that leftist or post-leftist sense of like, how does this, of defeatism. And also, like, Emma, to your point earlier, like, when I look at politics and psychedelia, like, for me, my early psychedelic experiences, going back to my first experience, was an inherently political experience. I mean, for me, my first trip was literally stitching together understandings about capitalism and work and social relations and realizing, oh shit, all of this is connected. So when you asked earlier, like, how do you make, there's sort of leftist skepticism that, like, in the afterglow of an LSD experience, that how does that help you engage with, like, the structural realities? There I was sort of in my mushroom afterglow, just like awash in all of these ideas, which then led to, like, trying to verify it, immersing myself in Chomsky or other political theorists, finding anarchism eventually, looking at histories of the 60s and the connection between the Black Panthers and Leary and, why are they in Algiers together and why do we see, where does the Weather Underground fit into this? And, being in my Psych 101 class and reading about these radical histories on Wikipedia rather than understanding that, how mental health is all a result of these sort of neurochemical interactions, which also goes back to Fisher talking about mental illness. And if I can just read this quote, where he says that saying that all mental illnesses are neurologically instantiated says nothing about their causation. If it is true, for instance, that depression is constituted by low serotonin levels, what still needs to be explained is why particular individuals have low levels of serotonin. This requires a social and political explanation, and the task of repoliticizing mental illness is an urgent one if the left wants to challenge capitalist realism. And when I read that, like, for me, there's me at 18, sitting in my Psych 101 class trying to make sense of, like, these radical political histories with my psychedelic experience and with the professor, on stage talking about how this is all just, like, brain chemistry.
Yeah, I think if I'd had a copy of Capitalist Realism kicking around when I was sitting in my undergrad psychology course, I would have been more interested in psychology. But as it is, I didn't. And I took one psych class and was really disgusted with it, even though I was super interested in the issues of, like, the mind and consciousness, and I was really excited for it. And then by the end of the semester, I was like, oh, what people say about the mind is really different from how I think about it. I'm going to just study philosophy, actually. But, so you actually make a really interesting connection, David, that I hadn't thought about, which is that while for-profit corporate ventures are doing what they do, are offering solutions for problems and either implicitly or sometimes explicitly depoliticizing mental health, they are reinforcing the structural logic which creates the conditions for the problems that they're trying to treat. And as much as I am a fan of Fisher's work and, this line of thinking, I do want to give a little side note and say that I'm not completely reducing mental health problems or broadly psychological conditions to political or economic effects. There's a whole conversation to be had there, but I just, it's not the whole picture. It's just something that I think is important to focus on, and hopefully this will remove, like, one negative Reddit comment or another in my future. But yeah, I mean, that is notable. It's something that sticks out.
And just on that point, just real quick, because Normie's used the analogy of, like, the environment is polluted. It doesn't mean that, like, all sickness is, like, caused by the pollution of our society, the way that our society is structured, but it's not, like, helping things that it's like, and trying to, like, in a polluted environment, trying to, like, only focus on individual solutions while you're adding to the concentration of wealth in the hands of the few and all these other kind of, like, factors that are leading to mental illness. Just definitely, like, seems closed-minded, short-sighted.
Just a real quick on that. I mean, nature versus nurture. These are old questions. I spent my PhD looking at pulling apart the interaction between genes and environment. And I guess I would just say that if all we're doing is looking at genes, which is very in vogue in the sciences, we're ignoring a very big acknowledged part of that puzzle.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, melancholy, rage, nervous energies, imbalances of the humors all existed before the rise of modern industrial capitalism. You know,
Miasma.
Exactly. Capitalism is not the cause of the human condition, whatever the human condition is, but it's not helping the negative aspects of the human condition. On the note of capitalist realism, and to kind of pull together a few threads, Fisher refers to a quote that has been attributed to both Frederick Jameson and Slavoj Žižek, which is that it's easier to imagine the end of the world than the end of capitalism, and capitalist realism is the psychological and also aesthetic cultural condition which makes it impossible to imagine anything outside of the structure that we have right now. And I've thought about that a lot, and I've asked myself, why is that? Or can I will myself to think about a non-capitalist world? Like, literally, what would my day look like? What would my friends' days look like if things were different? My neighbor's, job, things like that. My take on that is that if it is indeed impossible to imagine that, it's because capital is capable of subsuming literally everything, including thought, including anything that counts as thought, be it the words in our brains that we speak or that we type onto a screen, dreaming, feeling as a form of thinking, whatever. That can all be translated as financial value, at least if it takes what we would philosophically call a positive form or a manifest form. So I'm not sure that it's possible to express in language, in painting, in any form, something that looks like post-capitalism, that looks like the world after capitalism. What we need instead is to look at non-ordinary states of consciousness, including those induced by psychedelics, and associate them with a political and economic condition that would be more favorable. Because right now, everything that has been normalized and everything that is part of our shared consensus reality, I'm getting a little bit into woo-woo territory here, but I'm just going to run with it. It can become capital's foot soldier. So we need to look at that which is monstrous, to use the term that Neşe brought up, and in the sense developed by Derrida, we need to look at that which is just strange and weird and unhomogenizable. For inspiration, what does it mean for a bunch of people to have a transformative experience collectively, like meditating or doing a psychedelic drug with people that you love, family and friends? And what would it look like to try to bring those insights that you shared with each other, those feelings that you felt, and to wish for so many other people to have them, and to look at the policies that you could put into place? Like, how do we lift up material conditions? How does this change economics or approach to education, medicine, all of that, so that we can actually access those weird, monstrous, unruly parts of ourselves on a regular basis? Because if there is such a thing as a baseline for mental health, then it means having access to those transcendent, non-normal states of consciousness on a fairly regular basis. As if there is such a thing as a natural right, I think that is our natural right, to go there in our minds together with other people.
Hear, hear.
And it made me think of my my master's thesis was called Assembling an Army of Monsters, and I was reading Derrida with Marshall McLuhan and found historical evidence that the two of them, even though they were talking about in many cases very compatible ideas, they knew of each other indirectly through dominant culture's oversimplification and stereotyping of the other person. And so they were literally interacting with the defanged, like holographic projection of the other through dominant culture's lens. And so part of my argument in Assembling an Army of Monsters is finding ways to allow for communities of people with other kinds of experience, other kinds of ideas to interact with each other and share experiences beyond the defanging process of, what is not conducive to dominant culture. And I think it's like through that collectivity and coming together in relationship in ways that are not defined by what society now currently values and expects and thinks is significant will be, potentially one way. Because using the example of Derrida and McLuhan, had they been able to talk to each other and share their ideas, they could have advanced the deconstruction plus the like dreaming up crazy alternative worlds and like how those two things fit together. So that's just like one example of like how that's like wasn't happening historically and something that we can use to think of how to collaborate differently going forward.
Right. I mean, when you say that, I think of how political milieus have atomized so profoundly and become so fractured in a way that is absolutely counterproductive if we're going to have anything like solidarity. While on the one hand, I have my political beliefs and they're very strong, and there are a lot of things that I am not. One of them is a Republican conservative, another is a liberal Democrat.
I thought that's all there was, right? There's something else.
Oops, I've gotten myself
news to me.
I'm on the wrong podcast. Okay, we shouldn't just accept all political beliefs and, just come into ecstatic union with everyone politically and say that, in the spirit of true loving confrontation or non-confrontation with the other, that we're just gonna like totally take in everything that the QAnon shaman has to say or something like that. But among all relatively broadly defined political groupings, there is so much infighting and so much competition among those with small differences, especially in the left.
In academia?
Oh my gosh. Yeah, story of my life. That it saps us of collective energy. It absolutely does. And this connects to the conversation about neoliberalism because, well, while everybody is out there trying to build their brand, even if they wouldn't frame it as such, that's how people are self-actualizing these days online. They're individually mapping out different ideological positions to like Borgesian levels of exactitude, like trying to attain to the most perfect granular politics, like having the right position on every single thing. These are the words that we're allowed to say, and this is the correct take to have on this event that only happened 3 hours ago, and so on. And I don't want to go on something that seems like a rant against like woke politics, because that's not really what I'm saying here. But there is like kind of an inflection point between being quite radical in a way that's good and reinforcing the individual neoliberal logic of entrepreneurship of the self. And long story short, this is why I have a really hard time on Twitter.
Yeah, totally. Twitter's a jungle. I want to speak directly to what you're talking about, though. I don't know if you're familiar with the late commentator Michael Brooks. He wrote a book called Against the Web and had the Michael Brooks show. But in his book Against the Web, like challenging the like online new right, I think is the subtitle. He articulated something called a cosmopolitan international socialism, and he characterized it as something that was fundamentally built on like empathy and tolerance for a cosmopolitan worldview that had the eye towards building material power and building a movement. And it's very difficult to bring people along to build a movement when you have a laundry list of things that if they don't agree with you, then we can't work together, we can't talk or anything. And it sort of evidences an inability to build the ship while we're flying it, and which ultimately it's more like, I studied climate change for 10 years and actually used that quote that you mentioned earlier about capitalist realism and not imagining a future beyond capitalism in my dissertation, thinking about like the collapse of the global food system, because we have to imagine something, or else once capitalism collapses, we'll just have what's there and do that. And one of the things I think about when I think about change is that change is the only constant. It's the inevitable thing, and we can either acknowledge that and embrace change, or we can sort of get what we get. And so I don't know. That's kind of how I think about where we should be going broadly on the left. Is like, how do we ultimately make what we're doing seem like a better idea than whatever these chuds and I don't know, right wingers are trying to do. But not only that, the glib liberals are they're the worst. They're the ones that they say, won't this cage look nice if we just put some IKEA furniture in the corner over there? Go sit right there,
The liberals.
Yeah, I was gonna say that.
Love it.
So-
Love it.
So I just want to signal, one, Emma, I hope you've got a little bit of additional time, because we would very much like to talk digital capitalism, surveillance capitalism, corporadelia, and all of that. So what we're going to do, if it works for you, is we'll wrap this episode as a part 1, and then jump back in for a part 2. We'll record now, but they'll get released at whatever different times.
Sure.
But I also wanted to, just as sort of a fine point on both your comments and Pace's comments about sort of these, some of the political differentiation, the sort of immediate hot takes, the granular identification and performativity. There was a phenomenal essay in Hardcrackers by Shaman Salam titled Fanon, Floyd, and Me. And so it opens up saying, "It is one thing to hold a sign that says abolish the police. It is another to burn the 3rd precinct down." And there's a paragraph near the end in which he says, "For me, the biggest division has been over reform and revolution. Contrary to the idea of inherently radical BIPOCs, I have been in countless spaces of the BIPOC left where radicalism is mostly performative. The language of revolution and black liberation, just a thin covering for social democracy and liberalism. The performative aspects of identity have exhausted themselves and largely play a reactionary role these days. That is why what I largely concern myself with is, what have you done, and what are you willing to do, and when will you do it? Because that is the only text that matters. Words and performance do not stop bullets or abolish the police." And yeah, I guess,
Yeah.
do you have final thoughts? And then we can...
I have one final bit to say that's more of a response to Brian than what you just said. There's no way I can put what you just said into a more emphatic context. I totally agree with it. And yeah. But regarding Brian's point about working with other groups, or at least what I took away from it, I absolutely think that that leftism needs a better public image, to put it really crudely, or at least we need to show people who don't identify as leftists that it's not just about what they may see from internet discourse, or at least the discourse on the most popular social media platforms. And because there's an aspect of acid communism that's about a politics of joy, about coming together in a way that does things in the sense that David just expressed, it really truly does things, but also isn't purely associated with negative emotions and a negative disposition, that it would help to maybe get some more people interested in what this is all about, what anti-capitalism is about, that wouldn't normally be interested in it. And while some leftists are absolutely against trying to work with people who identify as libertarian, I'm not going to say like right wing or the alt-right or Republicans, but I know personally a number of libertarians who evolved to become quite committed leftists, and even leftist activists from like the age of 17 or 18 into their 20s, 30s, and beyond. I think it's possible. And that a focus on the connection between politics and psychology could be a meeting place between the left and some factions of the libertarian right.
Do you think do you think those people exist right now in the libertarian right? I wonder about this often, because like I often think, so I had a conversation at a cafe I don't know, a month or two ago with like a very big Trump guy, but we actually had like tremendous amounts of alignment on all these areas: anti-corporate, this, that, this, that, this, that, and the other. And then there was like some weird things that we're completely opposed to, but I don't know. I think there's a lot of alignment there. I personally see like less alignment in in libertarians or in, say, corporate Democrats. Just my personal opinion there. I don't understand why like disenfranchised people align themselves so strongly with the right or Mitch McConnell or this and that. It doesn't make any sense to me whatsoever. Those people, to me, are prime to recruit into a leftist kind of framework. There's a lot of work there, obviously, and this might be like pie in the sky, but I do think there's a lot there. I think that they think that they align with powerful Republican corporate interests, but they're actually really opposed to that.
Well, the red thread is populism, at least the way that I see it. There's leftist populism, and then there's right-wing populism, and Trump has been speaking as a performative right-wing populist. He's just actually a power-hungry mega capitalist without politics whatsoever, at least in my view. But whether it's self-identified libertarians or Trump supporters, I think libertarians are interesting because they're not socially and culturally conservative. A lot of them have super far out ideas and are on the level with not only psychedelics, but other things we associate with a progressive outlook. But I think one of the major points of attraction to libertarian ideology actually has to do with psychology, because there's so much of a focus on individuality and self-actualization. And neoliberalism has completely bastardized what it means to be an individual and to be self-actualized, because the point isn't that you as an individual don't matter. Your unique insights and way of seeing the world, you know, the stereotypical image of communism or leftism is that people can't express themselves as individuals or pursue their own lives in a unique way. And neoliberalism says that the only way to do that is to do it in a hyper-capitalist way. My leftism, my my individual acid communism would really help people connect the dots between psychological and individual self-actualization and that broader project of raising the material conditions of society, as above, so below. And if we could get that point across to some other people and say that, look, these economic interventions that are very left-wing are commensurate with individualism and sovereignty. I mean, hell, there's a whole like anarchist leftist literature that's just about this. We could really make that point clear and, point to some of the facts about, what economic deregulation has actually done in society. Then yeah, maybe we could.
I think you could
recruit.
pick off a few for sure.
It happened. I mean, I have friends. Some of my best friends were libertarians.
It seems to me that the libertarians, though, like an unsurmountable like speed bump, if you want to call it a speed bump, there is just like the unexamined belief of privatizing like all solutions. I mean, in this space right now, like it's completely unexamined. Like psychedelics as medicine should be a privatized solution. Like we don't even talk about it. Like it's just as invisible as air. It's that's just assumed. Of course, corporation. This is how we do it. Michael Pollan like says this, as well. Yeah,
It's not philosophical. It just is.
Yeah, sure. I mean, I think you could pick. Look, I think with the right messaging and the proper attitude and approach, I think you could probably pick off different people and different ideologies.
I'm probably not like giving enough thought to the economics of libertarianism because that's true. There may be like Trump Republicans or more moderate Republicans who are more in favor of regulation than libertarians, especially of the more like anarcho-capitalist flavors. But,
I think there's a lot of anger over decades of being like disenfranchised, and really it's about someone who comes around and channels that. It doesn't matter if it was Trump. It doesn't matter if it was Bernie. Like.
Yeah.
Really, I think a lot of the Trump voters would have voted for Bernie. It was just they're fucking pissed for a good reason, and he channeled that into a certain direction. I think those people are a hell of a lot less ideological than libertarians. This is how I feel right now in this moment. I might my views are subject to change, but they sort of make sense to me.
Though that makes perfect sense to me as well. And the truth is that, I mean, yeah, there was the weird, like, if Bernie doesn't get on the ballot, then I'm voting for Trump people.
Thanks, Joe Rogan.
I mean, the difference between that kind of, like, if you are that person, the Trump or Bernie person, and like what might sway you one way or the other if Bernie had been on the ballot might actually be relatively superficial cultural differences. Like even just what's around you, what your friends and family are talking about, what you've been exposed to. And that's really interesting to me that those differences could be so superficial. But I mean, long story short, there are people who don't identify as leftists. Maybe even we'll set aside the liberal Democrats for a second because they're a hard nut to crack. But who I think really could be one of us if we just had the right messaging and it wasn't just this, I don't know. There's kind of a very bleak image of the left, I think, even among so-called leftists.
And I think there's something to be said for material conditions and realities, like looking at like opposition to pipeline projects, looking at opposition to fracking, like when you wind up with indigenous communities, greenies, and conservative farmers unifying together in defense of a land base, like that's easy to sort of drop a pin on that. I think looking at certain other issues, perhaps it becomes more abstracted from direct ties to survival in that immediate way that becomes like more complex
wanna-
or yeah.
I want to say one thing that relates, and that's first, people don't know their history. They don't know what leftism is. They don't know what that means, and why would they? Why would they, given an entire advertising, cultural, educational apparatus that is designed to be not that. But ultimately, they don't know that labor struggles and unions are what got people pretty much everything they take for granted, whether it's the weekend, and they continue to do so. So that's one thing, but also just going back to the idea of like the left giving up on doing things, and some of these divides that were seem insurmountable. Like I remember the watershed moment that was the World Trade Organization protests in Seattle in 1999, where environmentalists, and in the Pacific Northwest, environmentalists were the traditional enemy of loggers and miners and other kinds of working class Joes. But they came together. Not only did they come together, but they came together to do politics in the streets. They came together to win. Like the leaflets at the time said that we're going to shut it down, and they didn't shut it down. We still have the World Trade Organization, but they did spark, a movement that played out in a certain way. And I think there's really like that sort of shoot for the moon, end up in the stars thing that we always have to remember. When you do embrace earnestness and really try and go all the way with something, you may not get what you were going for, but you're also not likely to get nothing.
Yeah. Here.
Cool. Well, I guess we'll end it there. Do you have any pluggables that you'd like to social media or contact or anything like that, as far as people finding you or following your work?
Sure. I am on Twitter. My handle is the number 14 followed by the word floating, all one thing, 14 floating. My website is oculus.com, and that's spelled like Oculus Rift, but there's a hyphen between the O and the C. And if you go to those sites, then you'll figure out how to contact me directly.
Cool. And yeah, we'll also put links in the show notes.
Cool. Great.
Cool. Thanks.
Yeah, thanks
for
Emma.
being
This
here.
was great.
Yeah, thank you for having me.